Hello everybody and welcome to my Assassin's Creed Black Flag verdict video, where I will, as always, share a few thoughts on the game I just finished. But before I begin with the actual discussion, let me say a few things about my schedule. I mean, I have mentioned it before, I posted it on my channel, but I do get a few questions in the comments here and there, specifically about the DLC for this game, which is primarily Freedom's Cry, and I think there's a smaller one called Evelyn. And to be clear, I am not going to play the DLC. Not because I don't think they are interesting. From what I've seen, it might be an interesting premise. I know that in Freedom's Cry you play as Ade, and in Evelyn, I guess you're playing as Evelyn again. But because I kind of want to cut down on content that is not essential to the story. When I committed myself to playing the Assassin's Creed franchise beginning to end, I said that I would play the main games, but I would skip spin-offs and I would skip probably most DLC, not necessarily all DLC. If I think the DLC is relevant to the story, I will play them. Of course, I don't completely know if it's relevant before I have played it, so I have to rely on descriptions of the DLC or what other people tell me to determine whether or not I want to play it. And people tend to have different opinions on that subject. However, a long story short, I have decided not to play the DLC for this game, at least not as a Let's Play. I still might play them just for myself. But simply because I have so many games still ahead of me, I have to skip at least some content of this franchise, or I will never get anywhere. So the next game in line, as I mentioned before, is going to be Rogue. Now, the status of Rogue is a little bit contested as well. Some people would maybe consider it a spin-off too, because, I mean, it was released the same day as Unity. So I guess it's not exactly one of the main games, but it seems to me that the general consensus on this game is that it is more vital to the story than the DLC. So I will be playing Rogue. And as I mentioned before, there will be one game in between, which is The Walking Dead Season 3. I guess Rogue will probably begin end of this month or beginning of the next, because I usually need about 2 weeks, maybe a little bit more, to play one season of The Walking Dead. So Assassin's Creed will return in a few weeks, and it's going to be Rogue. It's not going to be any of the DLC for Black Flag. That chapter is finished for now. And I know some people will be disappointed because they would like to see me play basically everything, but I need to make some compromises here, right? But okay, now that this is out of my way, let's get into my actual gameplay discussion. And as usual, I will probably start with the actual gameplay, although, as before, I don't have a whole lot to say about that, because, you know, it's Assassin's Creed. The gameplay doesn't really change that much. It is what it is. I do enjoy it. They usually try to improve it a little bit each game, but at the same time, they also manage to add a few quirks in every game. For example, in this game in particular, Edward had the weird habit of sometimes just pushing people out of the way when you were trying to perform a running assassination. That was very weird, because that didn't really happen to me in any of the previous games. Now, to be fair, this whole mechanic of pushing people out of the way automatically wasn't introduced until the last game. Before that, you would just awkwardly run into people and you had to push them out of your way manually. But still, it didn't happen to me in Assassin's Creed 3, this weird clunky situation where I was trying to assassinate someone from behind, and then I would just push them away, and my completely stealthy approach was ruined. So don't know why that happened in this game so often. Or another small annoyance was that performing air assassinations from a high distance was kind of difficult, because it was very difficult to target people. You can't really lock onto people anymore like you could before in earlier games. So on more than one occasion, I missed my target in an air assassination because I couldn't properly target my target. So that was always a bit weird. But apart from that, the gameplay was fine, just as always. I hope they will remove these quirks in the next game. We'll see about that. And as always, they added a few new elements of gameplay to this game. For once, they obviously increased the amount of naval combat, and they also improved the mechanics of the naval combat as opposed to the previous game. And that was actually quite a lot of fun. I enjoyed that, destroying and boarding ships. It made me feel like a real pirate. So that gets a thumbs up from me. And then there were smaller additions, like the diving missions. Was not a big fan of them, to be honest, so I really only did what was necessary here to get the schematics, for example. You had like these whaling missions where you could hunt sharks and stuff, which was okay, I guess. I did a few of them, but once I had enough money, I was really just buying the hunting supplies that I needed, and I wasn't actually doing these missions anymore. They were not really interesting enough for that. What else was new? I guess we had the blow darts, which were not that different from the throwing knives, except that you could actually use non-lethal methods by using sleeping darts. So that was definitely new, and I liked the fact that you finally had a dedicated non-lethal weapon. Because until now you really only had your fists, and first of all the fists only work at close range, and I think until the previous game, Assassin's Creed 3, you couldn't really stealth kill or make a stealth takedown with your fists. I seem to remember when I was trying to do that as Ezio, sneaking up on someone and attacking them with a bare hand, Ezio would just punch them in the back. He wouldn't, choke them out. I know that Connor did it, and obviously Edward did it. So this mechanic of taking down people non-lethally wasn't really introduced until the previous game. Until then, the only way was to get into an actual fist fight. So if you wanted to take someone down without killing them, not that it really matters in this game. You don't get any points for not killing people, but it's still a nice addition to the game that you can take down people non-lethally and even at a distance now. Although it still cracks me up that whenever I was trying to take out one of the sleeping guards permanently, Edward would just kick them in the stomach. That always made me laugh for some reason. But yeah, I guess that's really all the new gameplay elements that they added, so not much to say here. But let's talk about other technical aspects of the game, like the look and feel of the game. And I have to say the game again looks really beautiful. I already mentioned in the previous game that they really stepped up their game when it comes to creating beautiful environments. And by that I mean non-urban environments like the forest and so on. Because in games before that, the Ezio trilogy, while the cities looked really impressive, everything outside of the cities looked rather bland, and they really changed that in Assassin's Creed 3. And I think they even improved it in this game. I mean, this game is just beautiful, is it not? The water, the ocean looks amazing, and everything looks just like a holiday in the Caribbean. And I really enjoyed just, sailing around or running around because everything was just so pretty. And I think they did a good job with the settlements as well. So even though there was really only one bigger city, which was Havana, I mean, Kingston was kind of big, but it had a different architecture and layout. They still worked fairly well for parkouring, I thought. So the problem that I had in Assassin's Creed 3, where my parkouring and free running was always interrupted by ridiculously large roads and stuff, wasn't really that much of an issue in this game. I felt the cities worked fairly well for all kinds of parkouring, better than the previous game anyway. And maybe another thing that I want to add is that I liked in particular the music of the game. I mean, it is very obvious that some of the musical pieces were very heavily inspired by the soundtrack of Pirates of the Caribbean, right? But that doesn't really take away from them. I mean, they fit the situation. I feel that the soundtrack is very different from previous games. It's a lot more dramatic, a lot more cinematic, and I thought it fit really well, and I definitely enjoyed the music a lot in this game. So again, that gets a thumbs up from me. Alright, now that I covered the basic aspects of gameplay, let's move on to the narrative elements, which is the story, the characters, the setting. And when it comes to the story, I have to say that I have mixed feelings about it, because I think the story makes a whole lot more sense once you're finished with it. Because while I was playing the game, I thought that the story felt oddly unfocused at times, and that it was lacking a proper red thread to connect the different parts of the game. I mean, very early on, the game did establish a proper premise, which was basically finding the observatory and finding the sage to get into the observatory. And Edward said, that's what I'm going to do. So we had a premise, but then for large parts of the game, we were not really doing anything for that premise. And Edward was doing all kinds of other stuff. We had the whole storyline about Nassau and about Blackbeard finding medicine and all that stuff. And every now and then, Edward seemed to remember, oh yeah, there was this observatory, and maybe I will continue to work for that. And in retrospect, once you finish the game, it makes more sense, because it becomes obvious that the reason why the story was so unfocused and aimless and seemingly without purpose for large parts of the game is because Edward was aimless and unfocused and without purpose, and he just couldn't commit himself to one cause. So yeah, he always kind of wanted to find the observatory, but then he didn't, and he was just doing other stuff, whatever came across his mind, and that really had an influence on the way the story played out. So yeah, it makes sense in retrospect, but while playing it, I was sometimes kind of confused why I was doing what I was doing instead of doing anything for the premise of the game. So I don't know, maybe it's brilliant to craft the story like that and to make it, actually make sense at the end. Or maybe it's just weird because while you're playing the game, it's kind of hard to focus on all these different aspects and smaller stories. I mean, I thought that the smaller stories, like the one about Nassau or Blackbeard or whatever, were all very interesting in their own right. But again, it kind of made me lose track of what I was actually trying to achieve here. So I kind of became just as aimless as Edward, I suppose. But again, you could argue that this is actually brilliant storytelling, because once you realize that, Edward has just been wasting his time and has been doing stuff that he should not have been doing, and instead he should have been, trying to find the observatory maybe, or work with the assassins or whatever. So I guess I can see both points of views here. But I think it's still worth mentioning that the story does feel kind of disjointed at times, and as such, it doesn't really make a very good, coherent story. However, I think it does make a good character arc for Edward. As a matter of fact, I would say that Edward's character development was certainly the most interesting part about the story. I kind of expected that something like this would happen sometime in the game, because at the beginning he was just too much of a pirate, too much motivated by money and greed. So I felt that, at some point he's going to change his opinion and he will have a change of heart. But I have to admit that it happened a lot later in the game than I would have expected. Basically, it happened almost at the end of the game, and not as I would have expected somewhere in the first, I don't know, third of the game. So that was actually kind of interesting, and I feel they did a good job building up towards that. I mean, the death of Mary was apparently the most important event that led to his change of heart, but I would say it was not the only one. But everything else that happened before that, Blackbeard's death, and then the betrayal by Rackham, I think he was a guy who ratted him out, right? And who was a guy who tried to kill him on the island? I think it was Charles Vane. So basically, all his friends and comrades dying or turning onto him and stuff like that. I think it all accumulated in the end and made him look for a more steady purpose, I suppose. I mean, I feel that he always had a certain affinity for the Assassin's Creed, but he had only a very superficial understanding of it. So it took him a while to realize that there maybe is more to it. And if you remember my verdict video of the previous game, Assassin's Creed 3, I mentioned in that game that I hoped at one point we will get an assassin that will join the assassins for other reasons than revenge, as Ezio and Connor did, or, as Altair because he was just born into it. So I was hoping for someone who had different motivations to join the assassins, and this game certainly delivered. Revenge was not Edward's prime motivation. At first, it actually was just greed, I suppose. I mean, he was working for them and doing these contracts just for the money. But I think in the end, he actually did join because of some sort of conviction. Now, I'm honestly not entirely sure how committed he really was to that cause, simply because his change of heart happened so late in the game that we never really got to see him as a proper assassin, only for a very short amount of time. And apparently at some point after that he just returned back to England, and he may not even have been doing any more assassin stuff back in England. I don't know. We don't really know what he did once his daughter arrived, and I suppose after that he just went back to England or Wales or whatever. So he may have left the Brotherhood behind. But at least for a short moment, I think he was working for the Assassins because he felt that he was doing some good work here. So I think you could still argue that he joined out of conviction and not out of revenge or whatever. And that was kind of a problem that I had with Connor, because he did join mostly to execute his revenge. And his convictions were, well, sometimes I did believe them, but sometimes I just felt that he was working for the Assassins because, the guy that he was trying to kill was working for the Templars. And if it had been the other way around, he would be working for the Templars. Now, I did believe it in case of Ezio because Ezio had like 3 games to develop his character, and at some point, basically at the end of the first game, he kind of gave up on his revenge by not actually killing Rodrigo Borgia. And in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, he was definitely mostly working out of conviction because he saw how the Borgia are terrorizing the people of Rome, and he wanted to help them and liberate them and so on. So I think Edward's motivations were definitely more interesting than just repeating the same revenge story again. I didn't expect that the next assassin would start working for the Assassins because of money, but, I think it's a perfectly believable motive. And in the end, he did have his character development, and he certainly had a bit more insight into the Creed. And honestly, I bought it. I bought it that he does believe in the Assassin's Creed and that he worked for them out of conviction in the end. So yeah, I think they overall did a pretty good job with Edward as a character. They didn't try to do too much with his character, which I think was a problem in case of Connor, where they wanted to make him, an assassin and at the same time a mentor to other assassins and at the same time a young man looking for revenge. And it just didn't fit all together in one game. So in Edward's case, they try to focus on just some essential aspects and really develop these aspects. And I think they managed to do that. So I really enjoyed him as a character and I enjoyed his character development. And another aspect that I would like to discuss is something that a few people have said in the comments throughout this game. And that is the statement that Black Flag is a good game or a good Pirates game, but it is not a good Assassin's Creed game. Now, obviously, I don't really know why exactly people think that way. Is it because of the gameplay or the story or the setting? But I have to say that I don't really agree with this. As a matter of fact, this game felt more Assassin's Creedy to me than the previous one. I guess you could make a point about it feeling less like Assassin's Creed than the original or even the Ezio trilogy. But I don't really blame the game for that, because Assassins and Templars just feel more natively at home in the kind of setting we had in the first 4 games, like medieval, Mediterranean setting. And once you take it out of that setting and put it into a more modern setting, it just will feel a bit weird at first. So I think that is a large part why this game feels different. However, like I said, compared to Assassin's Creed 3, I thought this actually captured the spirit of the first few games a lot more. And I think it is partially because in Assassin's Creed 3, the real-world political conflict between the British and the Patriots was so prominent that it kind of overshadowed the whole Templar and Assassins conflict. And as a matter of fact, you barely had any assassins in that game at all. I mean, you had Achilles, and then he took on Connor as a student. And yes, while Connor did recruit more people to help him, it never really felt the same, because he wasn't a mentor, right? He was just a young student himself. So him taking on all these new recruits always felt a bit weird. So the Brotherhood didn't really exist in Assassin's Creed 3, I would argue. And we certainly had a return of that in this game. We had, an actual mentor. We had a bunch of real assassins. For example, the ones that you worked with for the Templar hunts. And I mean, yes, we did have quite a few Templars in the previous game. But their intentions and motivations were oddly unspecific, given the fact that we had a pretty prominent character that was a Templar, namely Haytham. Because on the one hand, the game was trying to portray them as backing the British side, but then Haytham said that they are in fact not, even though we've never seen any evidence to support that. So the only real tangible intention that we saw was that they were trying to find the key for the temple, which, by the way, was a kind of useless plot point because they never actually found the temple, which is again different in this game because we again had kind of a plot device where they were looking for some precursor artifact, or in this case a place, but we actually found it and we got to see it and we got to use it. So again, that made it feel more like Assassin's Creed to me. I think in Assassin's Creed 3 the story would have worked better if it was just a story about the historical political conflict without any Templars and Assassins, because they kind of felt tacked on to the story and they didn't really fit most of the time. And as I mentioned before in my previous verdict video, I think one of the reasons why that is because the conflict in Assassin's Creed 3 between the British and Patriots resonates a lot stronger with people today and is a lot more relevant to people today. So I think they were trying to be more historically accurate, whereas in this game I thought they were a little bit more relaxed about inserting their brand of sci-fi and fantasy and alternate history into the actual historical events, kind of like they did in the Ezio trilogy, for example. But in Assassin's Creed 3, like I said, the real-world conflict was just overshadowing all the Templar and Assassin aspects of the game, I thought. So yeah, I don't know. In terms of story and setting, I don't agree with the statement that this game doesn't feel like an Assassin's Creed game. As for the gameplay, I don't know. Sure, there are a lot of naval missions, but I think there are still more than enough normal standard Assassin's missions, both in the main story and the side missions. So yeah, I don't feel like that at all. I could see the point that maybe it doesn't feel like Assassin's Creed because your protagonist isn't really an assassin until the very end of the game. I guess that is true. But then again, it also was kind of true for Ezio. He didn't get properly initiated into the Order until pretty late in the first game. So it's not really an argument either. So yeah, I don't know. I'm sure people have their reasons for it, but for me, it most certainly felt like Assassin's Creed. And yes, it is different than older Assassin's Creed games, but that is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, this is game number 6 in the series, so they kind of have to change the formula a bit and have to add new aspects to keep it fresh. And, you know, they have to put it into different settings and not just always Mediterranean medieval settings, even though it feels more natural in that kind of setting, because otherwise it would just get stale. And I think it's also a lot of wasted potential to not, put the story into different historical settings. So yeah, I don't know. It's fine with me. So overall, I would say that apart from the fact that the story was a bit unfocused at times, I really only have one slightly bigger complaint, and that's the fact that your opponents, the Templars, were kind of bland in this game. I mean, you probably noticed it during the game that I always had problems remembering their names and who they were and what they were doing. There were just so many of them, and I just couldn't tell them apart. They were just blending together in one big uniform Templar mess, which makes sense, I suppose, because they're Templars. I guess they're not that big on individuality. I don't know. So, yeah, I guess the game was kind of lacking an interesting opponent. I would say the most interesting one you had in this game was actually your Sage, Roberts. He certainly had the most personality. And, well, maybe Hornigold. I think Hornigold was one of the Templars. He eventually ended up working for them anyway, who I actually remembered in the end. But the rest, like the guy we killed at the very end, Torres, I honestly didn't remember that he existed. So when the game was like, yeah, you still have to kill Torres, I was like, oh, right, there's still someone left. So the game definitely lacked a more charismatic opponent, which I think usually enhances a game. I mean, we definitely had one in the previous game, Haytham Kenway. We had the Borgia in Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood, and while they were not the most nuanced enemies, as a matter of fact, some of them were just like comic book villain level enemies, they were most definitely memorable. So I never forgot about Rodrigo Borgia or Cesare throughout the game, but I totally forgot about Torres and, you know, what he looked like or who he was and what he was trying to do. So, yeah, in this game, the Templars were kind of back to, you know, random, nondescript bad guys who occasionally say interesting stuff before they die. But I'm going to suspect that this will change in the next game because, as I mentioned, it's going to be Rogue. So we're actually going to work for the Templars this time. So hopefully the Templars will finally get some needed character development as a whole. I mean, Assassin's Creed 3 was a step in the right direction because Haytham certainly was a more nuanced character, but it was kind of offset by someone like Charles Lee, who again was kind of nearing comic book villain level. So I'm kind of looking forward to Rogue and see how they are going to introduce and portray the Templars. Because as I mentioned in an earlier Verdict video, I think having well-defined and nuanced enemy enhances the story. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to like sympathize with them or whatever, just because I think it's a nice thing to have, an interesting opponent and not just, a bland, replaceable bad guy that you have to kill. And in this game, I felt that most of your opponents fell into that category, with the possible exception of Hornigold and Roberts. And yeah, maybe one final aspect that I want to discuss is the Abstergo story. So basically the Out of Animus setting. Since they killed off Desmond in the previous game, they kind of had to introduce a new character. And again, I have kind of mixed feelings about this, because on the one hand, I think it is actually kind of clever to replace that fixed character, that is Desmond, with a character that could essentially be yourself, if you will. I mean, the character doesn't have a name. He doesn't have a face. He doesn't have a gender. It could be a she for all we know. So you could easily imagine yourself being that Abstergo employee. And I feel that this plays pretty well into the whole meta aspect of this framing story, where Assassin's Creed is actually a game or a movie or whatever in that world. And instead of playing a character, Desmond, that is then going into an Animus, playing out the life of another character, they basically remove one of these levels. And now it's you who goes into the Animus and playing out the other character. So it kind of makes the whole experience more immediate, if you will. On the other hand, of course, it kind of makes that character sort of faceless, literally. And since this is not really a role-playing game, it means that you can't give that character any kind of personality. So it's really just this blank canvas, and it pretty much stays this blank canvas. I mean, you don't really know what his opinion about the whole conflict between Templars and Assassins is. I mean, is he more in favor of the Templars, or is he more in favor of the Assassins? How does he feel about Rebecca and Sean contacting him or her in the end, asking him to work and hack even more computers? We don't know. This character is really just a framing device without any personality. So while on the one hand it kind of makes you feel that you're more involved into the game, it also makes you more detached from that character, because you don't really feel that much for him than you would have felt for Desmond, for example. And I mean, the real world story was not that interesting to begin with. I mean, you were just walking around hacking a few computers, and then surprise, surprise, there was a sage, which is something that, you could figure out if you read all of the messages that you find. I don't think the story or the framing story was bad, but it wasn't that interesting either. It also didn't really progress the overall story arc at all. I mean, we are still basically left off where we were at the end of Assassin's Creed 3. So yes, Juno is out there in the world, apparently somewhere in computer networks, and she's still there at the end of the game. So it didn't really do anything for the story in that regard. So yeah, I think on the one hand, it is kind of a clever way to frame the main story, which is the one about Edward. But at the same time, it wasn't really progressing the real world story arc at all. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this game. And again, I ended up doing a lot more missions than I originally planned, because I actually did all of the side missions, all of the contracts. And you know, every time when I start a game, I'm like, yeah, I will probably just skip some of the side content to speed this up a little bit. But in the end, I did them all because, you know, they were just so much fun. And that's a good thing because the game was a little bit grindy at times. For example, if you want to fully upgrade your ship, you need a lot of wood and metal, which means a lot of ships that you need to board. And this could have been very annoying if it wasn't actually fun to do these naval battles. I still think that it was a little bit too grindy, but I will forgive them that because I actually had fun doing it. So I guess all is good in that regard. But yeah, a great game. I thought it was also a great Assassin's Creed game. I definitely enjoyed it over the previous one. And now I'm looking forward to the next entry, which, as mentioned before, is going to be Rogue and a bit of a different experience because we hopefully get some more insights into the Templars. So I hope you're looking forward to that, and I hope you come back to watch it, or maybe watch my other Let's Plays if you're interested. And yeah, leave your thoughts on the game in the comment section if you want. But for now, I'm going to end my little discussion video here. As usual, thank you for watching, and see you again next time.